Hi, and welcome back. I promised at the end of my Bettermaker BM60 review to make a follow-up video if any comments shed light on that mysterious convolution feature mentioned in the marketing blurb. Possibly that's happened, but not in the way I expected. Maybe that feature isn't hidden at all, but the entire plugin is a convolution reverb that just loads impulses captured from the hardware. The push-button paradigm means you could cover every possible settings combination with just 128 impulses, if I've done the maths correctly. That's 2 different algorithms, multiplied by 4 room sizes, 4 decay times, 2 bass contour settings and 2 treble contour settings. And it has to be said, that pause when I change settings sounds more like switching IRs than changing delay times or filter cutoffs. I hadn't properly considered this option because, as everyone knows, vintage Lexicon reverbs use extensive modulation in the tails, which can't be recreated by a static impulse response. That convincingly Lexicon-style reverb I was hearing surely must have incorporated that modulation, right? Well, wrong. If I null test 2 instances with the same settings, they cancel completely. Meaning there's no random modulation, the reverbs are indeed static. I won't bore you with all the tests, but I ran through most of the different size and decay time combinations for both algorithms and got the same results. I'm honestly a bit embarrassed to have missed this before. So, is it loading IRs? I now think it probably is. Does that matter? And does it make it a snake oil con? After all, you could probably just download some free BM60 impulses instead, right? That one is harder to answer. It prompts a secondary question. Did the original BM60 use modulation for its reverb tails? I don't have a real one available to test, so I can't answer the question. I guess it's possible that the smaller, simpler Lexicon unit would use simplified algorithms that didn't include modulation. But then it also seems plausible to me that it would use more modulation to disguise shorter delay lengths. I can't reason my way through that one. If any of my viewers have a real unit, I'd be interested to know the answer. It should be easy to test. Bounce the same signal through it twice, all wet, then see if those 2 bounces null with each other. If they do null, then that means no modulation, and using IRs to capture the sound is totally fine. In fact, you'd be crazy to try to reverse engineer the code when you could just grab the IR and reproduce the sound fully and completely with that. I'll let you in on a little secret. I showed you my favourite plate plugin last time from UVI. I have a favourite setting on this which I use all the time, or rather I used to. I discovered a while ago that those settings, which don't use modulation or saturation, could be perfectly recreated with an impulse and with lower CPU use. It's not as if the UVI plugin is overly hungry, but why waste cycles if you don't need to? So now I routinely load one of 3 impulses I created at different decay times, and I can't hear a difference. If the BM60 reverbs are modulated, however, then an impulse isn't going to be the same. It's going to be a static snapshot of something that's constantly evolving and changing. And it occurred to me, perhaps this is the cause of the lumpy stereo image with the smallest, shortest plate setting. The delays happened to skew to the left at the instant the impulse was captured, but might have been more balanced moments later. I think that's unlikely, however. I think perhaps it's just very difficult to create short reverbs that don't mess up the stereo image or the frequency response, and Lexicon did a good job avoiding the latter, which is a bigger problem in my opinion. So my next thought was to test some real Lexicon reverbs to see if modulation was as big a part of the sound as I had assumed. Obviously, if I load a random haul from the PCM native collection, that's random, right? There's modulation in the tails. They don't null. But what about the room and plate algorithms? The default room preset nulls completely, as do all the top few presets in the list. When we get down to the live rooms, they're not nulling anymore. But the differences are still pretty quiet, suggesting very subtle modulation. With the plates, the default medium plate 1 preset nulls, but medium plate 2 doesn't. In case you're curious, the relevant parameters are to be found in the detailed edit view and are called spin and wander. These are the two I've discovered anyway. There may be other modulation parameters that I'm not aware of. But if these are turned up even just a tiny bit, the reverb tails don't null at all. At least, if spin is turned up, they don't null. Wander only seems to matter if spin is turned up as well. So it seems equally likely to me that the BM60 rooms and plates used modulation or didn't. It's certainly not the case that modulation is always a big part of Lexicon reverbs. It's important to note that when the analyzer shows big differences, that doesn't mean those differences are audible. Both instances would sound the same to you if you listened to them in isolation, in the same way that two different white noise sources would fail to null, but would sound the same regardless. So, final question. If the BM60 did include modulation, how much would it matter if you just captured a static impulse? Would you be able to hear the difference? Or is it only a theoretical difference that doesn't really matter in practice? Let's test that with the PCM random hall by creating an IR from it. This is easier than you might think when you're dealing with a plugin rather than a real room. Noise floor shouldn't be an issue, so you don't need to sweep a sine wave and then deconvolve the result. You can start with an impulse. This is just a single full-scale sample drawn in with the pen tool in SoundForge. Then bounce that through the plugin, and the result is the impulse response. That's it. No further processing required, except possibly to trim it to size. You can load this directly into your Convolution plugin, like so. So I wonder if we can hear the difference. And because the Lexicon interface is undeniably prettier looking than reverb, let's do it blind. What if we used a source with harder transients? As is so often the case, the difference is smaller than I had assumed it would be. So if this plugin is indeed just a fancy IR loader, should we feel cheated by that? I confess my initial reaction was to be disappointed that this appears not to be an algorithmic recreation, but then I started to wonder why. I liked the sound when I didn't suspect it was an IR collection, so why would I change that opinion just because it might not work how I thought it did? A well-made and well-curated library of impulses has value, after all. I used to have a huge folder full of free IRs I'd downloaded from various sources, but I deleted it because it just wasn't useful at all. There was no consistency of quality, or gain levels, or naming conventions, and finding something suitable was almost impossible. So anyway, I jumped on Google and looked for BM60 impulses. The top results were commercial libraries, which kind of makes my point that IRs have value. But I also managed to find some free ones pretty easily, created by Greg Hopkins. There were 32 BM60 IRs included, which is impressive given that it's only a small part of a much larger collection, but it's still well short of the 128 that would be required to recreate all the settings. And although the file names specify plate or room, and include numbers that appear to represent the size and decay settings, they don't tell us anything about the contour buttons, which make a big difference. So how do they sound? Well, it quickly becomes clear that these were captured with both contour buttons turned off, and they still sound a lot thinner and brighter than the Bettermaker plugin. If If I test the smallest, shortest plate setting, the Greg Hopkins impulse doesn't seem to pull left as much as the Bettermaker. But perhaps that's just because it has a lot less low-frequency content. Personally, I think I like the warmer Bettermaker versions better, and I like having the bass contour variations available as well. Also consider selecting impulses via the interface buttons, if that's indeed what we're doing, is a lot nicer than picking them out from a list of IR files, and is a much more efficient way to find the best one. I'm not remotely advocating you do this, but let's imagine that someone with no money or no scruples downloaded the demo of this plugin, then meticulously created their own impulses from it. It would be a little bit tedious to do, but 128 IRs is totally feasible. It's not a crazy suggestion. You could then, in theory, get all the same reverb sounds the plugin provides using your usual IR loader instead. But you would have to navigate them in a list like this, and they wouldn't include any of the extra options like input stage saturation, stereo width control, ducking, and so on. And if you weren't careful creating the impulses, you might find that, rather than a convenient pre-delay knob, you instead have random amounts of pre-delay burnt into the impulses, like many of the free ones I've found in the past. The Greg Hopkins ones seem okay in this regard, however. Well done, Greg. So I'm going to conclude that IRs do have value, especially when bundled with a dedicated interface with extra processing options, and I'll leave it up to you to decide if there's enough value there to justify the price tag. Can we conclude that the marketing is misleading? I'm not sure we can, as it does explicitly state it's a convolution reverb, albeit in a manner that made me think it was an erroneous copy and paste. I'm still not convinced it wasn't, honestly. Where's the vast library of captured acoustic spaces, for example? The most problematic part is probably this coveted 80s reverb algorithm bit. Built with the algorithm does rather suggest it's an algorithmic reverb, but it's a long way from a definitive statement. I think they could put that question to bed completely, however, by leaning into the convolution aspects in the bottom panel of the plugin. For example, rather than the gate option I proposed, or maybe as well as, why not give us the option to truncate the impulse? This can be a perfectly satisfactory alternative to normal reverb gating in the usual big 80s drums scenarios, but can also be useful on more sustained sources which can't be meaningfully gated. The reverb still stops suddenly at the end of the impulse, regardless of the input, so you can add huge reverbs without cluttering up the mix with long, lingering tails. If I steal an IR of the longest, largest room, then load that into the Shaperbox reverb, I can truncate it, or re-pitch it higher or lower. Adding options like these to the bottom section of BM60 would massively increase the range of reverb options, while also removing any hint of a suggestion that the developers are trying to disguise an IR loader as an algorithmic reverb. I was going to leave it there, but then I thought of something else. Is this plugin true stereo? What do I mean by that, you may ask? Obviously it's stereo. I even criticised it for being too wide at times. What am I talking about? Well, for a reverb impulse to be true stereo, it requires two stereo IRs, one representing what happens to a signal hitting the left input, and the other representing what happens to a signal hitting the right input. If you were capturing a real room, you'd record two impulses, one with the signal coming from the left side of the room and the other from the right. The easy test is hard pan the input signal one way. If the reverb tail ends up hard panned as well, that's not true stereo. That's a strong indication that this is just one stereo IR, not a pair of true stereo IRs, or indeed an algorithmic design. If the BM60 was in fact a true stereo reverb, then this would mean they'd only captured half as many impulses as were required, and I would consider this quite a serious flaw. Fortunately, however, the BM60 only had a single audio input, so the BM60 should really be downmixing its inputs to mono before the reverb, and I consider this just a minor oversight. Okay, that's all. Thanks for watching.